On the night of September 21, 1327, something happened inside the thick damp walls of Berkeley Castle. Something no witness would ever forget. It wasn't a battle, nor an uprising. No banners, no proclamations, no clash of steel, only a sound. A single prolonged cry, raw, tearing, unnatural, cut through stone, as if the stone itself had learned how to hear. The guards on the battlements saw nothing. But the moment that scream rose into the music darkness, they understood. That was no ordinary pain. That was a voice announcing ruin. A finale crafted not just to end a life, but to erase a meaning. It wasn't merely the fall of a man, it was the symbolic destruction of a king. A king who had once carried the crown of England. A king long considered weak, improper, and embarrassingly out of step with his age. That night, in a hidden chamber beneath Berkeley Castle, the ruling powers decided to close an uncomfortable chapter of English history quietly, cleanly, without leaving marks anyone could point to. It wasn't just an execution, it was a message. Edward of England, remembered as Edward II, had been deposed months earlier. He no longer commanded armies or signed decrees. His throne was gone. Yet he remained dangerous, not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. A defeated king could still become a symbol, and in medieval politics, symbols were feared more than swords. So his end had to be absolute and invisible. It had to look natural, inevitable, almost merciful in the eyes of the public. Before dawn, rumors were already drifting across nearby villages. Strange echoes, impossible sounds, cries that didn't seem to come from a human throat, but from something deeper, older, primordial. Generations later, people would still whisper about that night, saying the castle itself had screamed. The official story, short, dry, the king had died, nothing more. But behind that neutral phrase lay a truth no one dared to record outright. Edward II's death was not an accident, nor just the final step of political decline. It was the culmination of years of tension built around a question no one dared speak aloud. What happens when a king does not fit the image his era demands? In a world where royal masculinity was measured through military campaigns, dominance, and heirs, Edward was viewed as a dangerous anomaly. But this story doesn't begin at Berkeley or even on the night he died. It starts decades earlier, at the moment of his birth, under the shadow of a father both feared and revered in a court that punished difference. To understand why that night became necessary for so many, we have to step back and see how a prince destined for the throne was slowly turned into a warning. Edward of Curofan was born on April 25, 1284, into a world that had already written his role for him. Rigid, unquestionable, he was the fourth son of Edward I, the king later known as the Hammer of the Scots, a ruler forged through endless campaigns, a man respected for his brutal efficiency, even by those who hated him. From the first day, young Edward lived beneath an overwhelming shadow, a living example of what a medieval king was supposed to be: disciplined, conquering, unbreakable. But Edward's childhood carried a quiet contradiction. While his father spent long seasons in the north crushing rebellions and expanding borders through force, the boy remained at court surrounded by music, ceremony, and craftsmanship. And there he began showing interests that, though harmless at first, alarmed the tutors and nobles who watched every move he made. Edward wasn't drawn to military training or the brutal world of battle. He preferred carefully tended gardens, carpentry, musical instruments, and the company of people who worked with their hands. In a society where the heir was expected to learn command through fear and distance, this gentleness looked like weakness. Later, chroniclers would describe him as too approachable, too warm. A young man unable to project the severity a sovereign was required to embody. But beyond moral judgment, a deeper conflict was taking shape. one between personal identity and social expectation. Edward didn't reject the idea of being king. He simply couldn't mold himself into the version of masculinity that legitimized kingship. In the medieval court and arena where every gesture was noted, judged, and archived, his difference didn't go unnoticed. Nobles believed a king must be a living symbol of order. Any deviation, however small, threatened to weaken the throne. And so the prince's interests and friendships were interpreted not as personal quirks, but as warnings of a future problem. Over time, the emotional distance between father and son grew painfully clear. Edward I, hardened by war and authority, never hid his disappointment. The comparisons were brutal and constant. Where the father demanded firmness, the son offered gentleness. Where domination was expected, Edward sought companionship. Their relationship became a slow-burning conflict of expectations and identity, leaving scars on the young prince's character. Viewed from today, Edward's story raises an unsettling question. How much difference can a society tolerate in the person who holds power? In 13th century England, the answer was simple and brutal. Difference wasn't corrected. It was punished. And Edward, without knowing it, was already walking toward a fate where his personality itself would become evidence against him. It was in this tense atmosphere that a figure appeared, one who would change Edward's destiny forever. Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of modest lineage, far from the elite circles of English nobility. Perhaps that's exactly why his presence was so disruptive. To the young prince, Gaveston represented something the rigid court could never offer: warmth, loyalty without calculation, companionship without masks. To everyone else, he was an intruder, one who had somehow found a direct path to the heir's heart. Their bond drew attention immediately. It wasn't a discreet friendship or a typical noble alliance. Their connection was constant, visible, impossible to ignore. They shared quarters, daily routines, and a trust that blurred traditional hierarchies. Chroniclers, uncomfortable with the closeness, resorted to vague hints and careful silences, suggesting a relationship that crossed the acceptable limits of knightly camaraderie. In medieval politics, intimacy was never private. Every gesture carried implications. Gaveston quickly came to be seen not just as a companion, but as a gatekeeper, someone who controlled access to Edward, influenced decisions, and occupied a space reserved for highborn nobles. Alarm bells rang. This wasn't mere envy. It was fear. Fear that the established order was cracking. And when word reached Edward I, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Gaveston was exiled, not to punish Edward, but to protect the kingdom from him. But exile didn't break the bond. It strengthened it, and that was only the beginning. The exile was meant to restore order. To Edward I, it was a firm line drawn in stone. This foreign knight would not be allowed to shape the future king. But distance didn't weaken the connection between Edward and Gaveston. It sharpened it. Separation turned everyday closeness into obsession. Music messages passed back and forth, thick with longing and promises, as if the prince's world had become unlivable without him. For Edward, Gaveston was no longer just a companion. He had become shelter, an emotional refuge from a court that watched, judged, and quietly despised anything that didn't fit. And for the nobles, that persistence confirmed their worst fear. The heir to England was not merely attached to a favorite. He was dependent. This is the pattern history repeats again and again. When power becomes tangled with affection that the ruling class considers illegitimate, the reaction is rarely measured. It becomes surgical, ruthless, disproportionate. Gaveston stopped being a man in their eyes. He became an idea, a dangerous reminder that the prince did not follow the unwritten rules of authority. And in medieval England, dangerous ideas weren't debated, they were removed. Then in July of 1307, Edward I died, and the fragile balance holding the English court together cracked instantly. Edward of Kernaroon was only 23 when he inherited the crown, and with a single decision, he made it clear he had no intention of ruling by the script others had written for him. His first act was to revoke Gaveston's exile. Not quietly, not cautiously. He brought him back in triumph, wrapped in honors. As if he wanted the entire kingdom to understand one thing. This bond, this scandal, would now be protected by the crown. The impact was immediate and explosive. Gaveston didn't merely return. He was elevated to Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. To the great lords of England, this wasn't personal preference. It was an open insult to the hierarchy itself. A foreigner of modest origin had been lifted above men who traced their bloodlines through generations of English power. They saw it as collective humiliation. Like the king was publicly declaring that affection mattered more than ancestry. Whispers spread through the court, symbolic use, and those whispers turned into fury at Edward's coronation in February of 1308, that ceremony should have been the sacred opening of a new reign. It should have celebrated Edward's marriage to Isabella of France, a diplomatic union meant to strengthen ties with the French crown. But what people remembered wasn't the marriage. It was Gaveston. He took a place of honor that eclipsed the nobles. He wore clothing more lavish than the music kings. He moved through the ceremony like someone who belonged at the center of England's future. And Isabella, still barely a teenager, watched it happen. To a princess raised in the politics of gestures and silences, this wasn't just embarrassment. It was a warning. In that moment, she learned something brutal. She might wear a crown, but she did not hold the king. And in royal courts, public humiliation isn't forgotten. It's filed away, preserved, kept for the day it becomes useful. Over the following months, the king's closeness with Gaveston grew less discreet and more defiant. Gifts, lands, privileges, everything flowed toward the favorite with a generosity that bled the treasury and enraged the lords. Worse than the money was the influence. Gaveston controlled access to the king. He interfered in appointments. He mocked powerful men openly, as if daring them to react. And every insult reinforced a terrifying impression. The throne had not just a king. It had a gatekeeper. For the nobility, the crisis stopped being purely political. It became moral, symbolic. Embody the opposite. The more he insisted, the more the nobles became music convinced this reign had to be contained, corrected, or when the time came, eliminated. The breaking point came quickly. By 1310, what had started as murmurs of discontent music became organized resistance. A coalition of powerful lords, led by Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's own cousin, forced the king to accept a council of orders. On paper, it looked like reform. In reality, it was a leash. The goal was simple: limit the king's power and, above all, remove Gaveston permanently from the center of government. Edward agreed, but not willingly. Pressure wasn't just political, it was military. The kingdom was fracturing, and Edward lacked the loyal force he would have needed to crush opposition. So, in November of 1311, Gaveston was sent away again, this time to Ireland. Officially, it was to restore peace. In practice, it was an attempt to cut out what the aristocracy viewed as a spreading infection. For Edward, music, it was devastating. Surviving letters from that period show a king consumed by anxiety, unable to govern with clarity. His words to Gaveston carry urgency and desperation, like a man begging for oxygen. To the nobles, this wasn't romance or friendship. It was proof of incapacity. The king didn't just disobey. He couldn't function without his favorite. And so, in early 1312, Edward did the one thing the ordainers had tried to prevent. He ordered Gaveston's return. It was a direct challenge, a declaration that royal will stood above imposed agreement. But that act didn't save Gaveston, it sealed him. Lancaster and the other lords, men like Guy d'Ossom and Amar Devon, moved with cold coordination. What followed wasn't a formal war. It was a hunt. Edward and Gaveston fled together, moving from fortress to fortress, staying in sympathetic territories, always just ahead until they weren't. In May of 1312, Gaveston was captured while Edward was away trying to gather support. He was taken to Warwick Castle and held there for weeks. Edward offered everything: lands, titles, treasure, concessions that should have been unthinkable for a king to surrender. None of it mattered because by then the nobles weren't negotiating with Edward. They were correcting him. To them, Gaveston had become too symbolic to spare, a living reminder that the king could be bent by emotion, a sign that the crown might be ruled by intimacy instead of institutions. A crack in the story England told itself about power, and cracks were dangerous. So the decision was made quietly away from ceremonies and official music records. There would be no grand trial, no ritual legitimacy. Just a silent resolution designed to speak louder than any proclamation: no one breaks the invisible rules of the realm and escapes music the price. When word reached Edward, he collapsed into grief. Contemporary observers describe a king shattered, unable to focus, swinging between rage and despair, as if something inside him had been torn out. But Gaveston's death did not bring stability. It did the opposite. It left a vacancy, and soon that vacancy would be filled by someone even more dangerous. Not because of scandal, but because of calculation. After Gaveston, many believed the kingdom would finally settle. They were wrong. Edward's grief didn't turn into wisdom. It turned into desperation, a stronger need to cling to loyalty, to intimacy, to someone who made him feel safe in a music world that never accepted him. And in that vulnerable moment, the Despencer family emerged, especially Hugh Despencer the Younger, a man whose ambition would prove more corrosive than any earlier controversy. Hugh didn't arrive as a charming companion. He arrived as an indispensable administrator, a man who understood the king's weaknesses and knew exactly how to translate them into music power. And the pattern returned: constant closeness, rapid rewards, influenced music that spread far beyond what anyone could tolerate. But unlike Gaveston, who provoked with arrogance, Despencer operated with icy method, and England would soon realize this was not a repeat. This was an escalation. The court sensed the shift immediately. Where Gaveston had flaunted power, Hugh Despencer the Younger calculated it. Where arrogance once provoked outrage, precision now suffocated resistance. Concessions multiplied. Lands changed hands. Legal rulings began to favor a narrow circle, while Despencer's enemies found themselves buried under fines, confiscations, and procedural traps that left them stripped of influence. Government stopped being administration. It became retaliation. Once again, the king appeared, less like a ruler and more like a figure enclosed within a private orbit. Authority filtered through those who spoke in his name. Resentment spread beyond the nobility, reaching towns and communities that watched their rights quietly drained away. Queen Isabella was among those most deeply affected, gradually excluded from decision, denied access to resources, and even separated from her children. She recognized the danger clearly. This wasn't just personal humiliation, it was structural threat. As long as Despencer remained beside the king, her safety and the future of her son were uncertain. From a psychological perspective, Edward was trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape. Every loss drove him to replace intimacy with dependency. Each bond that offered comfort became a liability. The more he clung to personal loyalty, the more others believed he had surrendered the crown itself. Opposition reorganized. The lords, exhausted by broken promises, now viewed Despencer as a greater danger than Gaveston ever was. Tensions exploded into open conflict. Forced exiles, armed confrontations, shifting alliances. England slid into chronic instability, and the king's legitimacy eroded. Not because of a lost war, but because of perception. The sense that Edward no longer ruled for the realm, but for a narrow private circle. At that point, conspiracy stopped being an exception. It became a tool. Isabella watched, she learned, and she waited. Years at court had taught her a ruthless lesson. Patience could be more lethal than force. Her opportunity arrived in 1325, disguised as diplomacy. Edward authorized her to travel to France to negotiate unresolved disputes between the two crowns. On the surface, it was routine. In reality, it was the point of no return. Away from Despenser's grip and the king's surveillance, Isabella recovered something she had lost for years: freedom of movement. In France, music she was no longer decorative. She became political. There she reunited with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had been exiled after a failed rebellion against Edward and the Despensers. Mortimer wasn't reckless. He was patient, strategic. He understood the fractures tearing England apart. Together they formed an alliance. Unlike Edward's personal attachments, this wasn't emotional refuge. It was planning. They saw the same landscape: displaced lords, ruined communities, a monarchy weakened by dependence and resentment. The kingdom was ready, not for persuasion, but for replacement. Music in September of 1326. Isabella returned to England with Mortimer and a small force. They didn't need an army. As they advanced, resistance collapsed. Gates opened. Support gathered. One by one, towns and nobles chose sides. Not out of love for Isabella, but because belief in Edward had evaporated. In medieval politics, legitimacy could vanish overnight. Edward and Hugh Despenser fled west toward Wales, searching for refuge. It wasn't heroic. It was desperate. Their network had disintegrated. In November of 1326, they were captured. There would be no negotiation. Despenser's fate was sealed almost immediately, and it was designed to be seen. His punishment was not improvisation. It was theater. A warning crafted with intent. The former favorite was transformed into a spectacle. His body used to announce the moral victory of the new order. Every detail sent a message. Excessive power, when concentrated and despised, would be repaid publicly and brutally. Edward, however, was spared for the moment. Not out of mercy, out of calculation. Music, a living king, broken and isolated, could still be useful. He was moved from castle to castle, cut off from allies. While Isabella and Mortimer consolidated authority, then, in January of 1327, Parliament crossed a line England had never crossed before. Edward II was formally deposed. His teenage son was crowned king. It was a historic rupture. A monarch removed not by foreign invasion, but by political consensus. Yet one dangerous question remained. What do you do with a king who still breathes? Edward's existence, even stripped of power, was a liability, a living symbol, a rallying point waiting to happen. Isabella and Mortimer understood this. The challenge was no longer governing. It was preventing the past from returning. In the spring of 1327, Edward was transferred to Berkeley Castle. Officially, it was honorable custody. In reality, it was near total isolation. He was cut off from news, allies, and influence. Watched constantly, reduced to a suspended life, with no future and no function. The strategy was quiet attrition. Let time do what politics could not. Rumors spread anyway. Stories of degrading conditions of confinement meant to break spirit rather than body. None of it was formally recorded. But silence in medieval archives speaks volumes. Everything pointed toward a discreet ending, one that avoided martyrdom. But Edward did not die. Against expectations, he remained alive, and that persistence disrupted the plan. The solution had to be final and invisible. His body would need to be shown afterward untouched. No marks, no signs that could fracture the official narrative. In a world where appearance defined truth, evidence was dangerous. This was the moment the story entered its darkest territory. No document survives ordering Edward's death. No signature, no clear command. Historians have argued for centuries local initiative or silent instruction. From the highest level, what matters is this. From that moment on, Edward's fate was sealed. On the night of September 21st, 1327, Berkeley Castle became the stage once more. What happened inside its walls survives only through indirect testimony. Accounts passed cautiously, heavy with restrained horror. Chroniclers later agreed on one essential point. The king's death was engineered to leave no visible trace. But it was also meant to mean something. Edward's body became the final battlefield of a moral and political war. This was not just about eliminating a man. It was about rewriting his life, correcting in death what his existence had challenged. By dawn, silence returned. Officially, Edward II had died of natural causes. Unofficially, his disappearance closed. A wound power never knew how to treat openly, but truth has a way of resisting burial. His body was displayed with calculated solemnity. No external marks contradicted the narrative. Heralds spoke of illness and sorrow. The machinery of authority moved efficiently, sealing the case, clearing the path for the new reign. In December of 1327, Edward was buried with honors at Gloucester Abbey, as if ritual dignity could erase discomfort. It couldn't. Over time, stories leaked. Chroniclers like Geoffrey Labacher wrote of a death designed to leave no scars, a punishment layered with symbolism, aimed at what medieval society found intolerable. Later, writers doubted the details. Some suggested music exaggeration. Others imagined secret survival. But beneath every version lay the same core truth. Edward II's death was not merely political, it was moral. From a modern perspective, his story reveals something darker than the fall of a weak king. It exposes how absolute power fused with rigid social norms can produce cruelty, disguised as justice. Edward wasn't destroyed only for political failure. He was eliminated because he embodied a way of being his era refused to tolerate on the throne. In a world that demanded military dominance, dynastic certainty, and theatrical masculinity, Edward chose closeness over distance, emotion over spectacle, daily intimacy over epic war. Today, those choices might be called human. Then they were considered existential threats. An order answered with silent violence. The final irony is impossible to ignore. The attempt to erase Edward, to reduce him to an uncomfortable footnote, failed. While other medieval kings are remembered for battles and conquests, Edward, too, is remembered for how he was removed and for what his fate reveals about his time. His death became a mirror, reflecting a society unable to tolerate difference at the highest level of power. More than 7 centuries later, his story still asks disturbing questions. How often has stability been used to justify erasing the other? How many lives have been turned into warnings to preserve a norm? The echoes of that night at Berkeley do not belong to the past alone. They return whenever a society decides conformity matters more than humanity. If this story drew you toward the darker truths history tried music to silence, there are many more waiting to be uncovered. History is full of omissions, and understanding them may be the only way to keep them from repeating.